Hello and welcome to CNBC TV 18. In the last 3 months, the World Bank has committed $2.75 billion to support India's emergency COVID-19 response. This includes $1 billion for India's health sector, another $1 billion to increase cash transfers and food benefits to the poor and the vulnerable. Now the World Bank board has approved a $750 million MSME emergency response program for India. This will go towards supporting the immediate liquidity needs of 1.5 million viable MSMEs. Let's now get in Mr. Junaid Ahmed, Country Director for World Bank in India. Mr. Ahmed, thank you very much for speaking to CNBC TV 18. Tell us how this development policy loan augment lending facilities to MSMEs.
With pleasure. Thank you very much. Maybe if you permit me just to give a little bit of the logic of why we are in MSME today. With the arrival of the pandemic, the immediate reaction was to support government in the health sector. But the intervention in the health sector was very particular, as you know. There was social distancing and lockdown, as a result of which you had a purposeful slowing down of the economy. At that point, government introduced the Garib Kalyan Yojana to help the poor and vulnerable bridge this time of a slowdown until an economic revival happened. So we came in with $1 billion on the health. We came in with $1 billion behind the Garib Kalyan Yojana. And now the third part of government strategy, which is economic stabilization, is to ensure that the economic platform of the country is strong enough to take on the revival which we hope will come. And the key here is the MSME sector. And here, as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat Yojana, government has put 1.5% of GDP to support the MSME. And we're coming in with a $750 million programmatic loan to precisely support the MSME sector directly.
So in what form does it support the MSME lending facilities that the government is offering currently, the banks are offering currently?
Yes, so very good question. What has happened is government has intervened to create quite a bit of liquidity in the market, both the central bank, so the monetary policy, as well as government's own fiscal policy. The key now is how do you take this liquidity, which is at the wholesale level, and make sure that it really gets to the MSME directly. And what the government's program is that it's going to intermediate this money through private sector, through NBFCs, through small finance banks. Why? Because these banks are the ones that have a direct relationship with small and medium enterprises. They understand what they're doing. They can actually look at their credit worthiness. So government has created credit enhancement facilities which will de-risk the lending. So you have banks, the state-owned banks, you have commercial, you have private markets, which would then put money into NBFCs and small finance banks, which would then put money into MSMEs. So you're de-risking this whole line. And what our program does, it supports this overall ecosystem by one, unlocking the liquidity, two, supporting the NBFCs and the small finance bank because of the de-risking, and third element, to ensure as many MSMEs can be included to leverage fintech. As you know, India is a global player in fintech, and fintech allows you to actually access quite a deep variety of MSME because of the platforms that have been created.
Okay. So, Mr. Ahmed, is this a one-time loan? Is this being disbursed together, or will this be disbursed in phases? Are you also working with the state governments? How will this $750 million loan be distributed?
Well, it's actually not an investment loan. When we do an investment loan, let's say we put money into, as we did just a week ago, $500 million into the primary education program, then each year the money flows as government spends, as state government spend. This one is saying that government has created an economic framework, an ecosystem for MSMEs. And that ecosystem, as I said, has liquidity aspects to it, credit enhancement aspects to it, strengthening the intermediaries such as the NBFCs. So against this, we're putting a policy loan which goes out in one go. So $750 million underwritten in one go, because this overall ecosystem is one we believe that indeed can help MSMEs take forward the story. But you asked a question about states, which I just want to add. We are now working on a program with the Ministry of MSME, which will directly work with the states. And why directly work with the states? Because access to finance is only one aspect of MSME. The other aspects are access to capacity and access to markets. And there you have to work directly at the clusters, whether it's a textile cluster or a manufacturing cluster or jewelry and gems cluster, working with the state to support the productivity of the MSMEs so they can actually use this access to finance that government has created at the central level.
Right.
Move forward. That's where we'll engage with the states.
Okay, so I guess that would be the fourth round of support that World Bank would extend to the Indian government and different states as well. We would like to pursue that point in greater detail ahead in this interview, Mr. Ahmed. But I'd also like to ask you about the criteria, the benchmark that the World Bank would be setting for this development policy loan. The press release says that you would be focusing on about 1.5 million viable MSMEs. Is there a certain criteria, a benchmark that you've set? Any specific sectors that you would be focusing on?
No. So what again, very, very important to recognize that it's not a sectoral intervention, but a systems intervention. So the milestones that we're looking at is that this liquidity flows into the hands of the intermediaries, which are the NBFCs and small finance banks and others, and from them onto the MSMEs. Now we leave it to this set of intermediaries for whom this is a business. If they make the wrong business, then they're in trouble. So they're the ones who know which are the viable entities out there, where to put the money, and that's what we're looking for, is for them to choose where to put the money. But we expect most of the money will go into the small, micro, and small enterprises. You know, on average, we're talking about 5 people per enterprise. This is sort of the backbone which is behind the 150, 180 million people that have employment, mostly in the urban sector. Though this will also be in the rural sector because these NBFCs and small finance banks cover both areas. So it's very important. We're not predetermining where to put the money because we want the risks and the credit decisions to be in the hands of the banking sector.
Okay.
We know where to put the money.
Mr. Ahmed, we have been getting responses and feedback from industry bodies. They're saying that for the moment, viable MSMEs with good credit history are getting support from government schemes. They're saying that public sector banks are more approachable. Private sector banks are a little less approachable at this point in time when it comes to lending to MSMEs. They're also worried about the condition of stressed MSMEs. There are MSMEs which will find it difficult to recover after this 3 to 4 month period of lockdown. Do you think the government needs to focus on these stressed MSMEs as well?
Well, I think the program is a very, very intelligent program. It's first saying that we've got to get money into the viable MSMEs because we've got to get the economy revived again. We've got to get the economy moving. So let's invest in those elements that will take the economy forward. So that's the first intervention. The second intervention is there are those that are becoming stressed, but you know they'll become viable. They need the working capital. Let these intermediaries find them also. But I do want to make a very, very important distinction. This is not a relief program. This is not a program to basically fund the unviable. There you have a social assistance program through cash grants, through other forms of social assistance that deals with what we know is the impact on workers, impact on households if industry begins to falter. So it's important to keep the two distinct. This is not a relief program. This is about reviving an economy. It's about aiming to get the economic platform moving. If you really want to focus on supporting those who have clearly become non-viable, and there will be many that are becoming non-viable. This is the nature of shocks. Then the instrument of social protection becomes really the instrument that you want to use.
Right. I'd like to ask you about the demand scenario as well, because most of the MSMEs will be dependent on OEMs for steady and sustained orders in the coming months. If we look at the auto industry, for example, wholesale dispatches were down over 50% in the month of June. This will have a trickle-down effect on demand for MSMEs and their products too. Do you think this needs to be a focus area going forward? And will this be your focus area in the fourth round of support that you would be coming up with?
Well, on the demand side, I think it's very important that there the health sector story is very important because the more we're able to stop this pandemic, the more we're able to manage it, the more you open up the economy. Now, in my opinion, unlocking India means unlocking urban India. There are several urban clusters that really we need to have a public health engagement so that the unlocking can happen. That unlocking is critical to the creation of the demand. So it's important to recognize this, the instrument of health sector intervention that enables the unlocking, if you will, and the demand. On the other hand, there are already MSMEs that are beginning to go into the market, that are beginning to do business of different sorts. And it's important that working capital gets to them. They too have a multiplier effect, if you will, on the demand side. So there isn't one instrument on the demand side. Even the social protection, when you begin to give cash grants to people, that too has a little bit of a fillip, if you will, on the demand side. So the demand instruments are many, and you have to really pull them together. And that's why health, social protection, economic stabilization, this storyline of government is a very important storyline. Now, the question is, can one implement it to make this work?
Right. You know, that brings me to my next question. And this is based on IMF's latest projections that the Indian economy is likely to contract by 4.5% following a longer period of lockdown and slower recovery than anticipated in April. Now, while announcing the first support package, you had said that it's very important to tackle the health crisis in order to stage an economic recovery. How do you think India has fared so far and the challenges that lie ahead, sir?
You know, this is one where I've often said, I wish there was a blueprint, and all we could say is, did India follow the blueprint or did India not follow the blueprint? I think different countries around the world have discovered their way of trying to tackle the health crisis. If you look at United States, it allowed states in a federal system to choose their own path. If you look at a country like Sweden, it actually allowed citizens to choose how they wanted to go into social distancing. India went into a nationwide lockdown before it released. Different countries are approaching it differently, and you can begin to see that it really depends on how it's being implemented. I think the future growth really depends on the next phase of intervention in health. And the next phase of intervention in health, as I just mentioned, to me, it's going to be about how you create a municipal system of public health, which is able to do community surveillance, testing, isolation, ensuring social distancing. I mean, all of these are not rocket science. It's complete behavior. And to have those behavior, you need to have the local government engaging with citizens. You need, for example, which is being done, Anganwadis, Asha workers, self-help groups of women, which are the front line of India's fight against poverty, getting involved in messaging about the disease and managing. How can you transfer that into these urban centers? Because right now, it's in the urban centers that you really need to stop and arrest this pandemic. And that'll have an impact on economics.
All right. On that note, Mr. Ahmed, we're going to take a short break here on CNBC TV 18, but I request you to stay with us because we'd like to ask you about greater inclusion of MSMEs under the credit schemes that are on currently in India. Welcome back. We are in conversation with Junaid Ahmed, Country Director for World Bank. And the World Bank has announced a $750 million emergency response program for India's MSME sector. Mr. Ahmed, we were talking earlier about how only 8% of MSMEs are served by formal credit channels. How will this program, this latest support that you've announced, encourage greater inclusion of MSMEs in India?
I think there are two important vehicles here. One is the de-risking. Government is coming in with mechanisms which will allow government to take some of the risk up front, if you will, first loss of the lending. This will get more money into the hands of NBFCs, and NBFCs themselves will now have a greater incentive to lend. So this de-risking instrument is very important for broadening the delivery of the credit system. That's on one side. On the other side is where India has been an innovator and will continue to innovate is in the area of fintech. Fintech offers a series of platforms which allows, if you will, banks doing lending to use it to actually provide more credit, to assess the credit rating of the MSMEs, understand how they're functioning. So these two instruments, I think, are going to be very important to broaden the access. The third is what I referred to. We're going to be working directly with states through the Ministry of MSME, the MSME Ministry, in supporting directly clusters of MSME in building their management capacity, their financial management capacity, all broadly speaking, their ability to engage the markets. And second, to figure out an ecosystem where we can link them to markets. That will help improve the inclusivity of who gets access to finance. What I like about what's being done is instead of a scheme, the natural reactions of governments, or a project, it's trying to set up a system which we believe will take India forward in not only strengthening the MSME sector, but ensuring its greater inclusivity.
So there have been a slew of reforms that have been announced by the Narendra Modi government, including the new MSME definition, which has been widened to include firms up to a 250 crore turnover. But do you think there are more structural reforms also needed in the months to come?
So for us in the World Bank, one of the lessons we have learned is administrative definition of firms is a good way to deliver services. But actually what you're looking for is productivity regardless of the size of the firms. And so there, I think the structural issues that you talk about are exactly it. And broadly speaking, as I've been hinting, there are three buckets that you want to work on: access to finance and its structural issues, access to markets and their structural issues, and access to capacity, right? These are the three broad buckets, and you want to come up with mechanisms on the ground that facilitate all three. And that's why you have to be working in India's federalism with the states, because it's the state governments that will know the reality of where the comparative advantage of their MSMEs is, and what kind of structural support is needed. Right. What this operation is doing is it's really making a big dent on the structural issue of access to finance. Then the states will have to take forward the storyline of access to markets and access to capacity.
I'd like to ask you about the economic impact of Indo-China tensions as well. We're looking at the possibility where India may raise customs duties on about 1,000 import items. That is being considered right now. Consignments coming from China are being subjected to 100% physical examination. This is slowing down imports from China. Chinese apps are being banned as well. How do you think we need to balance national security concerns with our economic recovery needs right now amidst COVID-19?
Well, let me say that, nations take sovereign decisions, and they're decisions that are led by many criteria. So I'm not going to talk about national security and the politics of a decision-making process. Sure. But as a multilateral, what is it that we know about global trade? As a multilateral, we know that open markets are extremely important for growth of an economy. If we look at the MSME sector, here, government is investing in the MSME sector. Strengthening the MSME sector will position it to play a big role in global value chain. That's where India wants its MSME sector to move. Take these famous Italian cycles, right? We all go and buy an Italian cycle. Well, an Italian cycle is made somewhere between Brazil and Malaysia and China and India and Bangladesh, my own country. An Italian cycle is a multinational cycle. I think that even with all of the barriers that are being put up and the uncertainty we're seeing in the world, we know that history has proven that the ability to use global markets is an incredibly important impetus for economic growth. But to prepare for that, you have to invest in your own systems. And I think that this MSME program is one example of investing in the structures of MSME so they can play their role in the global markets.
My final set of questions, sir. This is a time when India is going to start engaging countries for FTAs very actively now. European Union recently signed an FTA with Vietnam. Do you think this gives Vietnam an edge? And also, which are the countries that India can focus on when it comes to trade negotiations?
This is not an area that I have focused on, and I would be the wrong person to offer any kind of views. But my perspective is the following. First is to push as much as possible to preserve open global markets, to open trading systems. There is no second story of gains from doing that. It is the biggest story. Second is, in all circumstances, when shocks happen in economy, industries begin to move. And when industries begin to move, it's a great opportunity to try and attract them into your own country. There, it's a combination of, sure, free trade agreements or special trade agreements, but I come from a school of thought that says if India today improved its delivery of electricity, water, and transport, if India today improved its logistics systems, ports, customs, and made it better, if India ensured that industry was not taxed in terms of electricity pricing, if India opened its agricultural markets inside the country, I think these changes would fundamentally position India as a big competitor globally. So I come from that school of thought that puts much more emphasis on setting up systems for global trade than necessarily for direct, if you will, free trade agreement. Having said that, as a Bangladeshi, if India wants to continue its free trade with Bangladesh, I'll be the first one to support you. I guarantee you that.
All right. And my final question, sir. The Prime Minister has announced an extension of the distribution of free food grains to over 80 crore people till November end. What more do you think needs to be done to support India's most vulnerable in the coming few months, considering we don't have a vaccine to tackle coronavirus yet?
Well, first of all, one has to congratulate the Prime Minister for this initiative. I think this is a fundamentally important initiative which shows that India continues to worry about poor and vulnerable during this downturn. And it was a very, very important shift. I think there are several things going forward. First, on the social protection system, I think we're at a watershed moment in India where India is beginning to shift its social protection from being a highly rural focus, Manrega and so on of the past, to dealing with the modern reality of India, which are urban systems, informal workers in the urban ecosystem. Coming up with a social protection system that protects the informal worker, the urban worker, I think is extremely important. Second is India is in a world where labor migration is not going to slow down, regardless of what happened in the past. It'll increase. The portability of social protection becomes important. These areas are what will make the next shift for India's social protection. So that's clearly one of the areas for protecting the poor. But the other area remains how we enter the health sector and how public health and the second phase of engagement in public health is introduced. I cannot emphasize enough, unlocking India means unlocking urban India. How India deals with municipal level public health is going to make or break how quickly India goes back onto its growth path.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed, for joining us and emphasizing how it's very important to tackle the health crisis to stage a robust and early economic recovery as well. Thank you very much for speaking to CNBC TV 18.